Hello everyone. Welcome to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, and I also know that this might be your first time coming across our channel. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded under the California stars, a tale of love turned dark, of promises broken, and of a man who survived what should have been his final moment. Our story begins not with violence, but with hope, with possibility, with two people finding each other in the vast digital landscape of the mid-2000s, both searching for connection. It was 2005. Gregory Mulvihill was a computer programmer, a quiet man who had moved to California from Oregon 5 years earlier to pursue his career in technology. He was 47 years old, methodical in his thinking, content with his routines. He wasn't the type to make waves, he was the type who solved problems, who wrote code, who built systems that worked. Diana Lovejoy was different. Born in 1972 in the coastal city of Carlsbad, California, she was vibrant and accomplished. She had graduated from UC San Diego with honors, earning her place in the prestigious Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. She worked as a senior technical writer for Salesforce, crafting documentation and instructions for complex software. But that wasn't all. Diana was also an athlete, a triathlete coach who had founded her own fitness company. She created YouTube videos about health and wellness, sharing recipes and workout tips with growing enthusiasm. They met on a dating site. In profiles and messages, they discovered they shared common ground. Both loved the outdoors, hiking the trails that wound through the California hills. Both understood technology. Both were at that stage in life where settling down seemed not just desirable but inevitable. Their friends would later remember them as a perfect match. Two people who seemed genuinely suited for one another, who laughed at the same jokes, who moved through the world with similar rhythms. They dated for 2 years before marrying in August 2007. The ceremony was private, intimate. They purchased a beautiful home in Carlsbad, a place with room to grow, room for the family they planned to build. Life stretched out before them, like an open road. But roads have curves, roads have shadows, and not every journey ends where we think it will. They wanted children. This desire, so common and so simple in its expression, became the first crack in their foundation. Diana suffered a miscarriage. Then, another, and another. 8 times they hoped. 8 times that hope was taken from them. The emotional toll was immeasurable. Each loss carved away a piece of their shared optimism. Where there had been excitement, now there was dread. Where there had been anticipation, now there was grief layered upon grief upon grief. But in September of 2012, finally, they welcomed a son, a healthy baby boy. This should have been their redemption, the moment when all the pain made sense, when the darkness lifted and light flooded back in. Instead, something had already broken between them that couldn't be repaired. By 2014, Greg had lost his job. In the midst of an economic recovery, he found himself unemployed. Diana became the sole breadwinner, working full-time to support the family while Greg stayed home as the primary caregiver for their son. The stress mounted. Diana began experiencing what she believed were serious health problems. She complained of chronic fatigue, of fibromyalgia, of mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't quite pin down. She became convinced that their young son was also suffering from illness, that he needed massive doses of guaifenesin, the active ingredient in Mucinex. She refused to have specialists at Children's Hospital examine him, trusting only her own assessment of his condition. Greg disagreed. He saw a healthy child. He saw his wife's increasing anxiety manifesting as medical concerns that didn't exist. Their marriage counseling sessions, their individual therapy, the attempts to bridge the growing distance between them, all failed to stop what was coming. In July of 2014, their separation became official. Diana filed for divorce. But this wasn't going to be an amicable parting. This wasn't going to be two people who sadly acknowledged they'd grown apart and wished each other well. Diana began making allegations, serious allegations. She claimed that Greg had sexually assaulted her. She said that in 2014, when her chronic fatigue symptoms were at their worst, she would wake up groggy and sore. She told friends that Greg had drugged her, that he had raped her multiple times while she was unconscious. She also alleged that Greg had been abusive toward their son. These accusations changed everything. Diana obtained a temporary restraining order. Greg was initially prohibited from seeing his child. The divorce proceedings, already painful, became a battlefield. An investigation was launched. Authorities examined the claims carefully, thoroughly. They found no evidence to support Diana's allegations. The court determined that there was no proof of sexual assault, no proof of abuse. The restraining order expired. The ruling came down, 50-50 custody. Both parents would share their son equally, and Diana would be required to pay Greg $120,000 as part of the settlement. Diana was furious. She didn't want to share custody. She didn't want to pay that money. She was earning approximately $10,000 per month at this point, but the idea of giving that large sum to Greg, of having to split time with her son, consumed her with resentment. By the summer of 2016, the divorce was in its final stages. A settlement had been reached on June 27th. The last financial details would be completed by late September. Greg was 3 weeks away from receiving $20,000 from Diana. The rest would follow. It seemed to everyone watching that the worst was over, that both could begin to move forward with their separate lives. But Diana had other plans. During the contentious divorce proceedings, Diana had taken up firearms training. She purchased a gun in late 2015. She needed to feel safe, she told people. She needed to protect herself. Her instructor was a man named Weldon Kenneth McDavid Jr. He was 50 years old, a former Marine, a school of entry instructor with expert marksmanship skills. He worked at a gun range in Oceanside, California, teaching people how to shoot, how to handle weapons, how to stay calm under pressure. He installed a security system in Diana's home. He spent time with her, teaching her not just about firearms, but about tactics, about strategy. And then he became something more. Despite being married, McDavid and Diana grew intimate. They began an affair. She confided in him about her custody battle, about her fears, about her anger at Greg. She told him the same allegations she'd told the court, the same stories about abuse and assault that had been investigated and dismissed. McDavid became protective of Diana. Some would later say he became obsessed. He told her he would help her, he would protect her, he would solve her problem. For $2,000 he agreed to eliminate Greg Mulvihill. September 1st, 2016, a Thursday evening in Carlsbad. The sun had already set. The air was cooling. At 10:44 in the evening, Greg Mulvihill's phone rang. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative. The caller identified himself as a private investigator. He said he'd been hired by Diana. He said he had documents, crucial documents that Greg would want to see. Evidence about the custody case. Evidence that could be used against him. The caller said he would leave these documents at a specific location. A dirt path off Avenida Soledad, near Rancho Santa Fe, a remote area. The documents would be taped to a utility pole. Did Greg want to see them? The caller said he'd phone back for Greg's decision. Greg thought about it. This was strange. Late-night calls about mysterious evidence weren't normal. But the custody battle had been so contentious, so full of accusations and counter-accusations, that nothing felt normal anymore. When the phone rang again, Greg said yes, he would go, but he wouldn't go alone. He asked his neighbor Jason Kovac to come with him, just as backup, just in case. Greg grabbed a bright flashlight. He gave Kovac a small aluminum baseball bat, the kind children use. Not much, but something. They drove to the location. These two middle-aged men, one holding a flashlight and one holding a child's bat, heading toward a dark dirt path because a stranger had promised evidence. The path was dark, very dark. The kind of darkness that exists away from streetlights and houses, where the night sky presses close. Greg held his flashlight up, the beam cutting through the black. They walked forward, following the dirt trail. They were looking for a utility pole, looking for an envelope or a package taped to its surface. They reached the pole. There was nothing there. No documents. No envelope. Greg's suspicions heightened. He began scanning the area with his light, sweeping it across the landscape. About 60 feet beyond the pole, he saw something in the bushes. It looked at first like a pile of clothes, maybe a homeless person sleeping rough. He focused the light more carefully, and then he understood what he was seeing. A person, in camouflage, lying in a prone position, the barrel of a rifle pointed directly at him. In that same instant, Greg felt like he'd been hit in the back. A massive blow, though he was looking at the gun in front of him. His mind couldn't process it. He'd seen the gun barrel, seen the person aiming, but the impact felt like it came from behind. He'd been shot. The bullet had entered under his left armpit and exited through his back. He was still standing, but something was terribly wrong. His mind screamed one word: run. Jason Kovac had seen it too. The rustling in the bushes, the gun. He'd yelled something, maybe gun, maybe Greg had yelled it. In the chaos, the terror, memory became slippery. Shots rang out. Multiple shots. The crack of an AR-15 style rifle splitting the night. Both men ran. Greg, bleeding, clutching his side, ran back down that dark path. Kovac ran beside him, the baseball bat useless against bullets. They made it to the car. Greg was driving, his hands shaking, blood spreading across his shirt. Kovac pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "My friend has just been shot," Kovac said, his voice tight with panic. "He's bleeding pretty bad." The operator asked questions. Kovac tried to answer. They were driving, trying to get away, trying to get to safety. Greg was fading. The blood loss was significant. An ambulance met them. Paramedics rushed Greg to the hospital. Emergency surgery. The bullet had narrowly missed his heart. Narrowly. If he hadn't turned to run at the exact moment he did, if the angle had been slightly different, he would have died on that dark path. But he survived. And then the investigation began. Carlsbad police didn't believe this was a random sniper attack. Random snipers hiding in bushes off dirt paths, waiting for whoever happened to walk by. That wasn't how these things work. This was targeted. This was planned. They began processing the scene. In the bushes where the shooter had been hiding, investigators found something unusual. Feces. The shooter had been waiting there long enough that nature had called. They collected DNA from the scene. They began tracing the phone call Greg had received. The phone was a burner, purchased specifically for this purpose. No monthly plan, no registration. The kind of phone bought with cash, used once, thrown away. Security cameras at a store captured footage of someone buying that burner phone. The person in the footage was Diana Lovejoy. Cell tower data placed both Diana and someone else near the location of the shooting on the night of September 1st. The DNA from the feces came back. It matched Weldon McDavid. Investigators obtained a search warrant for McDavid's home. In his garage they found multiple guns, a silencer, and the AR-15 style rifle used in the shooting. They also found a blast bag containing 7 spent shell casings. McDavid was arrested on September 2nd, 2016. Diana was arrested on September 22nd. The case began to come together. Phone records, cell tower data, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, witness testimony. Both Diana and McDavid were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The trial began in October of 2017. Greg Mulvihill, recovered from his injuries, took the witness stand. He described the phone call, the drive to the remote location, the sight of the gun barrel emerging from the bushes, the feeling of being shot. Jason Kovach testified about what he'd seen, about the terror of those moments, about calling 911 while Greg bled. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the burner phone purchased by Diana, the DNA evidence linking McDavid to the scene, the rifle found in his garage, the cell tower data, the $2,000 payment. Diana's aunt took the stand. She testified that a year before the shooting, Diana had asked her if she knew someone who could scare Greg or kill him. Diana did not testify in her own defense. McDavid did testify. His defense was that he'd been a trained Marine sniper. If he'd wanted to kill Greg Mulvihill, he would have. He claimed he'd only been trying to shoot out the flashlight Greg was holding. He said he'd fired when he heard someone yell, "I have a gun." He said this was all a misunderstanding, that he'd never agreed to murder anyone. The jury didn't believe him. Deliberations lasted about half a day. On November 13th, 2017, the verdicts were read. The courtroom was full. Family members, media, observers, everyone waiting. The jury found Diana Lovejoy guilty. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of attempted murder. As the words were spoken, Diana's face went pale. Her eyes widened, and then she collapsed. People in the courtroom gasped. Her family members began sobbing, crying out for someone to help her. The judge quickly cleared the courtroom. A television reporter who happened to have emergency medical training rushed to Diana's side before paramedics arrived. She was conscious but in shock, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Paramedics wheeled her out on a gurney. After about half an hour, court resumed. The same jury delivered their verdict for Weldon McDavid. Guilty on all counts. He put his head in his hands and cried. The jury forewoman later told reporters they'd seen through McDavid's testimony immediately. "We rejected his story pretty much off the bat," she said. "He was lying. It was getting absurd at times." She explained that the jury believed McDavid had hit exactly what he was aiming at: Greg Mulvihill's torso. The fact that Greg survived was because he'd turned to run at the precise right moment, not because McDavid had missed. As for Diana's motive, the forewoman was clear. She didn't want to share custody, and she didn't want to give $120,000 to her husband. Sentencing was set for late 2017, but was delayed multiple times. Finally, on January 31st, 2018, both defendants stood before Judge Sim von Kalinowski. Diana spoke first, crying throughout her 15-minute statement. She maintained her innocence. She claimed she would never take her son's father from him. "I could never be able to do that," she said, "and it's so painful that some people in the world would think I would have it in me to do this." She tried to discredit witnesses against her, including her own aunt. She complained that the system had failed her. She spoke of a higher reality of what she and McDavid had intended to do, though she never explained what that reality was. The judge responded briefly. You said you had no voice in your trial, he told Diana. That was completely your choice. She had chosen not to testify. He also addressed one of her stranger claims. Diana had said she'd used her computer to search for the next new moon phase, because her son liked to look at the moon. The prosecution had argued she was planning the attack for the darkest possible night, for tactical advantage. A new moon is no moon, the judge said. So if your son likes to look at the moon, why are you looking up no moon? That makes no sense. McDavid spoke next. He insisted he hadn't meant to shoot Greg Mulvihill. There was no intent to kill, he said. That's not who I am. He claimed that if he'd truly intended to kill Greg, there is no way I could miss by more than 2 inches. He seemed to be arguing that his skill as a marksman proved his innocence. If he'd wanted Greg dead, Greg would be dead. The judge responded, Mr. McDavid, let me briefly respond to your comments. 12 unbiased persons came to unanimous decisions, rejecting your claims. Enough said. The prosecutor, Jody Brennan, addressed the court. She pointed out that both defendants were blaming everyone but themselves. What you hear is it's everybody else's fault but their own, she said. Judge Von Kalinowski delivered the sentences. Diana Lovejoy, 26 years to life in prison. Weldon McDavid, 50 years to life in prison. McDavid was also ordered to pay Greg Mulvihill $500,000 in damages. Diana would be eligible for parole in 2036. She is currently serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Greg Mulvihill survived. He recovered from his physical injuries, though the psychological scars remain. He gained sole custody of his son, and has since lived a quiet life in Carlsbad, staying out of the public eye, focusing on raising his child alone. The bullet that was meant to end his life missed his heart by the narrowest of margins. If he hadn't turned at exactly the right moment, if the angle had been just slightly different, we would be telling a different story. A story about a murder, not an attempted murder. Diana Lovejoy, once a successful technical writer and fitness coach with a growing YouTube following, now spends her days behind bars. The woman who believed she could solve her problems through violence learned that justice, while sometimes slow, eventually arrives. Weldon McDavid, the trained Marine who thought his skills made him untouchable, learned that expertise with weapons doesn't grant immunity from consequences. And somewhere in Carlsbad, a young boy is growing up, knowing that his mother tried to have his father killed, that his father survived only through chance and quick reflexes, that his mother will spend most of his childhood, perhaps all of it, in prison. What drives someone to murder? What calculus happens in the mind when a person decides that ending another person's life is the solution to their problems? In Diana's case, it appears to have been a combination of factors: the resentment over losing full custody of her son, the anger about having to pay $120,000, the belief that Greg had wronged her, even when investigations found no evidence of abuse, the relationship with McDavid, who encouraged and enabled her worst impulses. But perhaps it was simpler than all that. Perhaps it was just the inability to accept that she didn't get her way, that the court had ruled against her, that she would have to share her son and share her money and share her life in ways she didn't want. Murder in the end is often about control. When someone feels they've lost control of their life, of their circumstances, of their future, violence can seem like a way to seize it back. But control is an illusion. Diana thought she was taking control by hiring McDavid. Instead, she was giving up any control she had left. She was setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to her own imprisonment, to the loss of her son, to the destruction of everything she claimed she was trying to protect. The truth investigators discovered was simple. Diana didn't want to share custody. Diana didn't want to pay the settlement. And Diana was willing to kill to avoid both. She failed. and in failing she lost everything. So if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story from a quiet Missouri town, where the ordinary rhythm of life was interrupted by something extraordinary. This is a story about love and betrayal, about custody battles and desperation, about choices made in the darkness that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. On the morning of November 14, 2020, in the small bedroom community of Willard, Missouri, a neighbor made a phone call that would change everything. She had stepped outside early that morning, perhaps to retrieve her newspaper or simply to breathe in the cool autumn air, when she saw something that didn't belong in the peaceful neighborhood. On the front porch of the house next door, two bodies lay motionless. Willard is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. It sits just 12 miles outside Springfield, a town where violent crime is almost unheard of. The houses are modest, well kept. Children ride their bikes on the sidewalks. People wave to each other from their yards. It's the American dream in miniature, a place where families put down roots and build lives together. The responding officers arrived to find a scene that would haunt them. On that front porch lay 28-year-old Alexander Stephen Shute and his fiancée, 30-year-old Brianna Sproul. Both had been shot multiple times. The number of shell casings scattered around their bodies suggested not a single calculated shot, but a violent storm of gunfire. So many bullets that investigators initially thought they had walked into the aftermath of a wild shootout, some kind of desperate gunfight between multiple armed individuals. But as Major Shannon Shipley of the Willard Police Department would later explain, finding anybody dead in that manner was something almost unheard of in their quiet community. This wasn't the kind of place where people killed each other. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you expected to find murder on a Saturday morning. Inside the house, officers made another discovery. The front door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a break-in or a struggle inside the home. On a table near the door sat a fanny pack containing 2 Glock magazines, sitting in plain view. And in the bathroom, hiding in terrified silence, they found Alexander's 4-year-old daughter, completely unharmed but alone and frightened beyond measure. The little girl couldn't tell them what had happened. She had heard sounds in the night, terrible sounds, and had hidden herself away as children do when the world becomes too frightening to understand. Officers gently lifted her into their arms and took her to protective services, where she would remain while they tried to piece together what had transpired in the early hours of that November morning. A .40 caliber handgun lay inches from Alexander's hand. At first glance, to untrained eyes, it might have looked like a murder-suicide. 1 gun, 2 bodies, a tragic domestic situation gone horribly wrong. But Major Shipley and her team were thorough investigators. They examined the scene carefully, methodically, and when they found shell casings from a second gun scattered around the bodies, that initial theory dissolved like morning mist. This was not a murder-suicide. This was something else entirely. Someone had come to this house in the darkness. Someone had brought a gun, and someone had opened fire on Alexander and Brianna, as they stood on their own front porch, in their own home, where they should have been safe. To understand what happened on that November morning, we need to go back in time, back to a high school in upstate New York, where two teenagers from displaced families found each other and fell in love. Alexander Stephen Shute hadn't always lived in New York. He was originally from Missouri, but circumstances had brought his family north. His parents had divorced when he was young, and like his siblings, Alex had spent time living with his grandmother. It was a fractured childhood, the kind that leaves marks on a young person's heart, though his family would later remember him as resilient and loving, despite these early challenges. Teresa Cox, on the other hand, had come from North Carolina. She too had been raised by her grandmother after what family members would later describe as a troubled upbringing. The details of her early years remain somewhat shadowy, but we know that she didn't have the stable, nurturing childhood that every child deserves. When Alex and Teresa met in high school, they recognized something in each other. They were both transplants, both outsiders in a way, both carrying the weight of complicated family histories. Daryl Shute, Alex's father, would later recall that they were pretty much together all the time, every day. Alex's mother, Lisa Peeney, remembered how smitten her son had been with Teresa. It was young love, intense and all-consuming the way it can only be when you're 17 and the whole world feels like it's opening up before you. They married right after high school, a whirlwind romance that swept them both into adulthood before they might have been ready. The newlyweds moved to Missouri, back to Alex's roots, where his family could provide support as they built their new life together. Within a few years, Alex enlisted in the United States Army and joined the National Guard. He was building something, creating a future, taking on the responsibilities of manhood with determination and pride. Just as he finished basic training, in May of 2016, Teresa gave birth to their daughter, a baby girl. For Alex, it was the fulfillment of a dream. His family would later say that he absolutely loved being a father, that his daughter was his everything, that he was very good with her and loved to play with her. He had the chance to be the kind of father he'd always wanted, to give his child the stable, loving home that he himself had sometimes lacked. But Teresa struggled with motherhood. When Alex was deployed to Poland for a short mission, the young mother began to falter. Alex's family had to step in to help take care of the baby. Teresa, according to Alex's sister Valerie Mathern, didn't seem to understand what being a mother meant. She didn't have a maternal bone in her body, Valerie would later say, though whether this was born from judgment or observation, we can never fully know. What we do know is that the marriage began to crack. By 2019, Alex and Teresa were divorced. They shared joint custody of their daughter, shuttling her between two homes, trying to co-parent despite whatever had broken between them. It wasn't easy. Custody arrangements never are, especially when the relationship that created the child has ended in pain and disappointment. Alex moved on. He found new love with Brianna Sproul, and by December of 2017, they were together. Brianna was 30 years old, a few years older than Alex, and their relationship seems to have been one of genuine affection and partnership. They became engaged. They built a life together in that house in Willard, raising Alex's daughter in a home filled with hope for the future. But Teresa's life was taking a different path, one that would lead to darkness and tragedy. In the months leading up to November 2020, the tension between Alex and Teresa had been escalating. What had been a difficult but manageable custody arrangement was deteriorating into something more bitter, more desperate. Alex had made a troubling discovery. His daughter was being left home alone at night while Teresa went to work, a 4-year-old child, alone in a house after dark, while her mother worked the late shift at a Pizza Hut in Springfield. The details of how Alex learned this aren't entirely clear, but once he knew, he couldn't unknow it. He couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. He called Child Protective Services. It was a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Though in hindsight, perhaps someone should have seen what was coming. CPS investigated. They found the allegations credible, and eventually the decision was made. Alex would get full custody of their daughter. The child would live with him and Brianna, full-time, in that house in Willard. For Alex, it was a victory born from necessity. He had protected his daughter. He had done what a father is supposed to do. But for Teresa, it was a devastating loss. Her daughter was being taken from her, and not just taken but removed by the very systems designed to protect children. There was an active investigation into allegations of physical and sexual abuse perpetrated by Teresa, though the full details of these allegations have never been made fully public. On November 3, 2020, less than 2 weeks before the murders, Teresa was served with additional paperwork from Alex's attorneys. They were cutting off child support. The custody battle was over and she had lost everything. According to investigators, this was likely the straw that broke the camel's back, the final humiliation that tipped Teresa from anger into action. But Teresa Cox wasn't the type to act alone. She was the type to manipulate, to scheme, to draw others into her web, and she had already begun spinning that web months before, pulling in people who would help her carry out a plan that had been forming in her mind for some time. Teresa worked at a Pizza Hut in Springfield. It was the kind of job that millions of Americans work, making pizzas and taking orders and trying to get by. But this particular Pizza Hut would become the staging ground for murder. Teresa had a new boyfriend. His name was Duncan Bogle, though he went by the nickname Mixie. He was only 20 years old, 8 years younger than Teresa. Friends would later describe him as impressionable, easily influenced, the kind of person who always wanted to make other people happy. Duncan was, as one person would later say, the perfect mark for someone like Teresa. Teresa and Duncan met in August of 2020, just a few months before the murders, and almost immediately, according to one of Duncan's close friends, Teresa began pressuring him to kill her ex-husband. The friend would later tell police that Duncan came to him multiple times, crying, saying he felt pressured and didn't want to do it. But Teresa was persistent. She painted Alex as a monster, as an abuser, as someone who was hurting their daughter. She convinced Duncan that she needed protection, that their daughter needed protection, that Alex had to be stopped. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter to Teresa. What mattered was getting what she wanted, and what she wanted was for Alex to disappear. Teresa's manager at the Pizza Hut was a man named Matthew Plum. He was 43 years old enough to know better, and yet somehow Teresa managed to pull him into her scheme as well. Matthew would later admit to police that he knew Teresa was planning to have Alex murdered. He knew, and instead of calling the police, instead of trying to stop it, he helped her plan it. It was Matthew who suggested that they plan the murder for a night when they were all scheduled to work together. It was Matthew who advised Teresa to report her handgun stolen before the murder, creating a paper trail that would supposedly distance her from the weapon when it was inevitably found. And it was Matthew who agreed to give Teresa an alibi, to tell police that she was at work during the hours when Alex and Brianna were being killed. Teresa even tried to recruit Matthew's nephew, an 18-year-old named Theron Plum. The young man initially agreed to help, pulled in by his uncle's influence and Teresa's manipulation. But as the date approached, Theron got cold feet. He backed out, telling police later that he couldn't go through with it. Even he, young and impressionable as he was, could see that this was wrong. But Duncan didn't back out, despite his tears, despite his fear, despite calling his friend in hysterics and saying he didn't want to kill anyone. Duncan Bogle was going to follow through, because Teresa had convinced him that sometimes, some people have to die. November 13th, 2020. A Friday night. The plan was in motion, though Duncan was falling apart. In the days leading up to the murder, text messages between Teresa and Duncan revealed the progression of their scheme. On November 11th, Teresa texted Duncan, "Change in plans possibly for Friday." Duncan replied within a minute, "Are you sure?" They discussed it, ultimately deciding to move forward. On November 13th, the night before the murder, Duncan sent another text to Teresa, "I need some time to air out my mind and get into a good place for tomorrow." He was trying to prepare himself mentally for what he was about to do, trying to find some way to justify the unjustifiable. That evening, Teresa, Duncan, and Matthew Plum all worked the late shift at the Springfield Pizza Hut together. According to the plan, Teresa pretended to be having car trouble. She claimed her transmission was acting up, preventing her from making deliveries. This meant she had to stay at the restaurant, creating her alibi, while Duncan could borrow her car. And in that car was a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun, the gun that Teresa had purchased and reported stolen just days earlier. Around 11 p.m., Duncan called his friend. He was in Willard, sitting in Teresa's car with the gun. He was crying, screaming, hyperventilating. His friend begged him not to do it. "Don't do it," he said over and over. But Duncan hung up and stopped responding to texts. The doorbell camera at Alex and Brianna's house would later help investigators establish the timeline. Sometime in those early morning hours, between Friday night and Saturday morning, someone approached the house in Willard. Alex and Brianna were on their front porch, perhaps hearing a noise outside, perhaps opening the door to see who was there. And then the shooting began. Multiple shots. So many that investigators initially thought they were dealing with some kind of gunfight. But there was no gunfight. There was only murder, quick and brutal and final. Alex and Brianna never had a chance. They fell on their own porch, under the night sky, while their 4-year-old daughter hid in the bathroom inside. Duncan drove back to the Pizza Hut. According to Matthew Plum's later testimony, Duncan was very upset when he returned. Matthew drove Duncan home, and along the way, he stopped at Rutledge Wilson Farm Park. There, with Theron Plum and Theron's girlfriend in the car as witnesses, Matthew threw the murder weapon into a creek, trying to hide the evidence of what they'd done. The next day at the Pizza Hut, employees noticed something strange. The restaurant was a mess. It hadn't been cleaned properly after the late shift. Teresa and Duncan, who should have been taking care of their responsibilities, had instead spent the night at the restaurant, holding each other, trying to process what had just happened. The general manager would later say that Teresa and Duncan were in fugitive mode, and indeed they were. Within days, they dyed their hair. They got a ride from a delivery driver to a truck stop in Joplin, Missouri, and from there they disappeared, heading west toward California, toward San Francisco, toward some imagined escape from what they'd done. Major Shannon Shipley and her team worked quickly. They knew from the beginning that this was a targeted attack, not a random act of violence. The evidence at the scene made that clear. But who would target this young couple? Who would want them dead? The answer was hidden in plain sight. When investigators examined the house, Major Shipley found old paperwork regarding the custody battle. Documents showing that Alex was trying to gain full custody of his daughter, that Teresa was losing her child. Right then, Shipley would later recall, it really focused their attention on Teresa's involvement. But Teresa had an alibi. She had been at work during the shooting. Matthew Plum confirmed it. Her cell phone data confirmed it. She was at the Pizza Hut until 1 a.m., and she was home by 1:30. The timeline seemed airtight, except it wasn't, because as investigators dug deeper, cracks began to appear. They obtained a search warrant for Teresa's phone and found those suspicious text messages with Duncan. Change in plans possibly for Friday. I need some time to air out my mind and get into a good place for tomorrow. What were they preparing for? What were they planning? On November 17th, just 3 days after the murders, a tip came in through Crime Stoppers. Someone mentioned Duncan Bogle's name. Investigators found Duncan's friend, the one he had called crying and hyperventilating. The friend told them everything. He told them about the pressure Teresa had been putting on Duncan for months. He told them about the phone call on the night of the murder, when Duncan was sitting in a car in Willard with a gun, crying and saying he didn't want to kill anyone. And then the friend told them about the follow-up call, after he'd seen the news about the murders. He had called Duncan and said, "Mixie, you killed those people." Duncan's response had been chilling. "Sometimes some people have to die." The investigation expanded rapidly. Investigators interviewed Matthew Plum, and under questioning he broke down and confessed to his role. He told them about helping Teresa create an alibi. He told them about advising her to report the gun stolen. He told them about disposing of the murder weapon in the creek at Rutledge Wilson Farm Park. Police went to that creek and recovered the gun. The serial number matched the box found at Teresa's home. The crime lab analyzed the shell casings found at the murder scene, and they matched the recovered weapon. The physical evidence, the witness testimony, and the digital footprint all pointed to the same conclusion. Teresa Cox had orchestrated the murder of her ex-husband and his fiancée, and she had convinced 4 other people to help her do it. On December 2nd, Matthew Plum was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, armed criminal action, and evidence tampering. But Teresa and Duncan were gone. They had fled to California, thinking perhaps that distance would save them, that they could blend into the crowds of San Francisco and disappear forever. They were wrong. The United States Marshal Service is very good at finding people who don't want to be found, and Teresa Cox and Duncan Bogle were exactly the kind of people the Marshals specialize in tracking down. Less than 2 weeks after Matthew Plum's arrest, on December 8, 2020, U.S. Marshals located Teresa and Duncan on the streets of San Francisco. They had cut and dyed their hair, trying to change their appearance. According to prosecutor Philip Purdy, they were attempting to blend in with the homeless population, perhaps thinking that anonymity could be found among the forgotten and overlooked. But you can't hide from murder. You can dye your hair, and change your clothes and move 2,000 miles away, but the truth has a way of catching up with you. Teresa and Duncan were arrested and extradited back to Missouri. They were charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and armed criminal action. Duncan faced an additional charge of endangering the welfare of a child, because Alex and Teresa's 4-year-old daughter had been in the house during the shooting, hiding in that bathroom while her father was killed on the front porch. Therein Plum, Matthew's nephew, was also arrested and charged with tampering with physical evidence for his role in helping dispose of the gun. 4 people in total. 4 people who had all in various ways participated in or facilitated the murder of 2 innocent people. 4 people who would now face justice for what they'd done. The legal proceedings moved forward, with the weight of inevitability. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were credible. There was no real defense to mount, no plausible alternative theory that could explain away what had happened. In January of 2021, Teresa Cox and Duncan Bogle appeared in court for their preliminary hearing. 5 witnesses testified, including Matthew and Theron Plum, who described their roles in the conspiracy. The judge determined that the testimony and forensic evidence was sufficient to send the case to trial. But the case never went to trial. In October of 2022, just before their trials were set to begin, both Teresa and Duncan entered into plea agreements. On October 26th, Duncan Bogle pleaded guilty. He admitted to his role in the deaths of Alexander Shute and Brianna Sproul. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of child endangerment. 2 days later, on October 28th, Teresa Cox also pleaded guilty. She admitted to the murders, admitted to orchestrating the entire plot, admitted to manipulating Duncan and Matthew and Theron into helping her eliminate the man who had once been her husband. On October 31st, 2022, nearly 2 years after the murders, Teresa Cox and Duncan Bogle stood before a judge for sentencing. Alex's family was there, his mother Lisa Peeney, his father Daryl Shute, his siblings, all of them there to see justice done. Though no amount of justice could ever bring back the man they loved. Lisa Peeney addressed the court. "Justice may be served here today," she said, "but it will never be enough for me." Daryl Shute was more direct. Looking at Teresa, he said, "Suffice to say that she is the face of evil." Teresa was given the opportunity to address the court. She spoke about her daughter, about how everything she had ever done was to give her the best life she could, about how her daughter's safety, security, and happiness were her priorities in this life. She expressed hope that someday, if her daughter wanted it, they could have a relationship. The words rang hollow to Alex's family. "We didn't expect anything from her and she delivered," Lisa Peeney said afterward. "I didn't expect anything from her because she's a psychopath," Daryl added. Duncan Bogle also spoke. Unlike Teresa, he seemed genuinely remorseful. "I just want to begin by saying I'm sorry to the family, and I'm sorry to Alex and Brianna, and I'm sorry to Sophie," he said, using the name of the little girl who had lost her father. "I don't know why I did what I did. I knew it was wrong, and on the way there I was asking myself, what the hell am I doing?" The family was surprised by Duncan's remorse. A lot of times people don't have remorse like that. But he did. "We were all kind of shocked," Lisa Peeney said. Daryl Shute admitted, "I was surprised. I do feel somewhat sorry for him. He was a tool for Teresa Cox. But remorse doesn't erase what was done." The judge sentenced both Teresa Cox and Duncan Bogle to 2 consecutive life sentences each for the murders of Alexander Shute and Brianna Sproul. Duncan received an additional year for the child endangerment charge. Under Missouri law, they won't be eligible for parole until the year 2073, more than 50 years from the date of sentencing. Matthew Plum, in exchange for his testimony against Teresa, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Therein, Plum, the youngest of the conspirators, faced charges for tampering with physical evidence. The details of his sentence are less clear, but he too paid a price for his involvement, however peripheral. Alexander Stephen Shute was buried with full military honors, as befits a man who served his country in the National Guard. His family gathered to remember him, to celebrate the life he had lived, cut short at just 28 years old. Brianna Sproul, who had done nothing more than fall in love with a man who had a complicated past, was mourned by her own family and friends. She was 30 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. She and Alex had plans, dreams, a future they were building together. All of it ended in a burst of gunfire on a November morning. And what of the little girl, the 4-year-old who hid in the bathroom while her father was murdered? She is being raised by Alex's family now. She's with her grandmother Lisa, her grandfather Daryl, her aunts and uncles who love her and are doing everything they can to give her the stable, loving home that her father wanted for her. She has no mother now, at least not one who can be present in her life. Teresa Cox sits in prison, will sit in prison for decades, perhaps for the rest of her life, and the girl has no father, will never again feel his arms around her, never hear him laugh or play with her or tell her that he loves her. Major Shannon Shipley, reflecting on the case, said something that captures the senseless of it all. She didn't want her daughter. I think that she didn't want Alex to have her daughter. I think she just wanted to wipe that side of her life away. For Teresa Cox, the loss of custody wasn't about losing the child she loved. It was about losing control, losing the battle, losing to the man who had once been her husband and had moved on to build a new life without her. Rather than accept that loss, rather than find a way to coexist peacefully for the sake of their daughter. She chose murder. She chose to destroy rather than to surrender. Police Chief Tom McLean, who oversaw the investigation from the beginning, expressed gratitude for the work of his officers, the State Highway Patrol, the Greene County Sheriff's deputies, the U.S. Marshals, and even the community members who provided tips and support. Together we were able to get it done, he said. But getting it done, solving the case and securing convictions, doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't bring back Alexander or Brianna. It doesn't give that little girl her father back. Justice was served, as much as justice ever can be in cases like this, but the hole left by violence remains. The story of Alexander Stephen Shute is a reminder of how quickly life can change, how darkness can intrude into the most ordinary places. Willard, Missouri is still a quiet town. Children still ride their bikes on the sidewalks. Neighbors still wave to each other from their yards. But the people who lived through those November days will never forget what happened, will never be quite the same. There are lessons here, though they're painful ones. About the dangers of manipulation, about how easily vulnerable people can be drawn into terrible acts, about the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues, about narcissism and control, and the desperate lengths some people will go to, rather than accept loss. But there are also glimmers of light in this darkness. The friend who tried to stop Duncan Bogle, who begged him not to go through with it, the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve the case, the family who rallied around a traumatized child and gave her a home filled with love. Matthew Plum, who eventually cooperated with authorities, perhaps seeing too late the magnitude of what he'd helped facilitate. And there is the memory of Alex himself, who by all accounts was a good father, a loving partner, a man who served his country and tried to protect his child. He made the right choice in calling CPS when his daughter was in danger. He did what fathers are supposed to do, and it cost him everything. But his daughter survives. She has family who love her. She has a future, one that her father fought for, even if he didn't live to see it unfold. And perhaps in the end that's the only justice that truly matters, that the child is safe, that she has a chance to grow up, to heal, to become whoever she's meant to be. The story doesn't have a happy ending. True crime stories rarely do, but it has an ending where truth prevails, where the people responsible for violence face consequences, where a child who lost everything is surrounded by people who will do their best to help her find her way forward. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story together, one that unfolded quietly in the everyday routines of military life, behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. This is a story about trust, about the slow unraveling of a marriage, and about the moment when something as simple as a morning cup of coffee became a matter of life and death. So as we settle in, let me tell you about Melody Filicano Johnson and Roby Johnson, and the strange case that began on a military base in Germany in the spring of 2023. Roby Johnson was a man of routine. As an airman in the United States Air Force, he understood the value of order, of structure, of knowing what to expect each morning when he woke. And like millions of people around the world, his day began with coffee, that familiar comforting ritual that helps shake away the fog of sleep and prepares you to face whatever challenges lie ahead. In March of 2023, Roby and his wife Melody were stationed in Germany. It was just another posting in a military life full of them, another place to call home for a while, before the next assignment came through. They lived together in military housing with their child. But beneath the surface of this ordinary family life, cracks had begun to form. The Johnsons were going through a divorce. The papers weren't finalized, but the decision had been made. They had been together for 17 years, nearly 2 decades of shared history, of building a life together, of navigating the unique challenges that come with military service. 17 years. That's long enough to know someone's habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities, long enough to know exactly how they take their coffee each morning. One morning in March, Roby noticed something odd. His coffee tasted wrong. Not just stale or poorly brewed, but genuinely unpleasant, off. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the flavor made him pause. Still, people often attribute strange tastes to bad water or old coffee grounds, especially when living on a foreign base where everything from the plumbing to the coffee brands might be different from what you're used to back home. So Roby didn't think too much of it at first. He finished his cup and went about his day. But the next morning, the coffee tasted strange again. And the morning after that, each day that same unpleasant quality was there, lurking beneath the expected bitterness of the brew. It wasn't his imagination. Something was definitely wrong with his coffee. For weeks, Roby drank it anyway. He would later say he pretended to drink it, continuing the routine while his mind worked through the puzzle of what might be happening, because somewhere in those weeks, a terrible suspicion began to form, one that seemed almost too dark to believe, too sinister to be real. What if someone was putting something in his coffee? What if that someone was Melody? Roby Johnson made a decision that would change everything. Rather than confront his wife directly, rather than dismiss his suspicions as paranoia born from the stress of their failing marriage, he decided to investigate. He would approach this methodically, carefully, gathering evidence before making any accusations. His first move was practical and clever. He went out and purchased pool chemical testing strips, the kind people use to check the chlorine levels in swimming pools. These simple strips change color when exposed to certain chemicals, providing a quick and easy way to detect substances that shouldn't be in your drinking water. Roby tested the tap water first. The strips showed normal results, nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the strange taste in his coffee. Then he tested the coffee itself, the brew that came from his coffee maker each morning. The results were shocking. The strips revealed high levels of chlorine in the coffee, not the trace amounts you might find in treated tap water, but concentrations that indicated something had been deliberately added. Someone had been putting household chlorine bleach into his coffee maker. The implications were staggering. Bleach is poisonous. Consumed in small amounts over time, it can cause severe internal damage, burns to the throat and stomach, damage to internal organs, bleeding. In larger doses it can be fatal, and someone had been adding it to his coffee, day after day, morning after morning. Roby needed proof. Suspicion and test strips might be enough to convince him, but they wouldn't be enough for the authorities. He needed to document what was happening, to capture evidence that would be irrefutable. So he set up a hidden camera in their home, positioning it where it could watch the coffee maker without being easily detected. And then he waited. When he reviewed the footage, his worst fears were confirmed. The camera had recorded Melody approaching the coffee maker. The video showed her adding something to it, some substance that Roby believed was the source of the chlorine. But he was thousands of miles from home, stationed on a foreign base, navigating the complex jurisdictions of international military law. He made a calculated decision. He would wait until they returned to the United States to report what he had discovered. So for weeks more, Roby continued his routine. He pretended to drink the coffee that he now knew was poisoned. He watched as Melody went about her days, maintaining the ordinary rhythms of their life together while allegedly trying to kill him slowly, one cup at a time. The psychological toll of this deception of living with someone you believe is trying to murder you, of pretending everything is normal while gathering evidence, is almost impossible to imagine. But Roby Johnson had a plan, and he was determined to see it through. In late June of 2023, the Johnson family returned to the United States. They were assigned to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, where they were initially placed in temporary housing, while arrangements were made for their permanent quarters. This was Roby's opportunity. Back on American soil, under the jurisdiction of local law enforcement, he could finally report what had been happening. But first, he wanted more evidence. The video from Germany had shown Melody near the coffee maker, but it wasn't entirely clear. He needed footage that would be unmistakably incriminating, that would show exactly what was being put into the coffee maker, and leave no room for doubt or alternative explanations. So even in their temporary housing, Roby set up another hidden camera. He positioned it to watch the coffee maker, and once again, he waited. The camera captured Melody's actions. But when Roby took this evidence to the Tucson Police Department on July 6, 2023, the response was not what he had hoped for. The officers who reviewed the footage felt it was unclear, inconclusive. They couldn't definitively see what Melody was pouring into the coffee maker. The video quality wasn't good enough. The angle wasn't quite right. They declined to pursue the case based on this evidence alone. For many people, this would have been the end of the road. The authorities had seen the footage and deemed it insufficient, but Roby Johnson refused to give up. If the problem was video quality, then he would get better cameras. He purchased high-quality hidden cameras designed to look like smoke detectors, devices that would blend seamlessly into the home's ceiling while capturing clear, high-resolution video of whatever happened below. In July, the Johnsons moved into their permanent housing on the base. Roby installed his new cameras, positioning them carefully to capture every angle of the kitchen and the coffee maker. The cameras looked like ordinary smoke detectors, the kind found in every home, drawing no attention, raising no suspicion. And then, once again, he waited. On July 11, 2023, one of Roby's hidden cameras recorded something damning. The footage showed Melody in the kitchen, going about what appeared to be ordinary household tasks, but then the video captured her doing something unusual, something that would prove impossible to explain away. The camera recorded Melody taking a bottle of bleach. She poured some of the bleach into a separate container. Then, carrying this container, she walked over to the coffee maker. The video showed her pouring the contents of the container, the bleach, into the coffee maker itself, directly into the reservoir where the water goes. A week later, on July 18th, the cameras recorded her doing it again. Same routine, same deliberate actions. Bleach into a container to the coffee maker, bleach added to the reservoir. The footage was clear, high quality, unmistakable. There could be no doubt about what was happening, no alternative interpretation of her actions. Roby returned to the Tucson Police Department with this new evidence. This time, there was no ambiguity, no room for the officers to dismiss his claims. The video clearly showed Melody Johnson poisoning her husband's coffee with household bleach. The police moved quickly. They obtained a search warrant for the Johnson home and executed it immediately. When officers arrived, they found exactly what they expected to find. The liquid inside the coffee maker smelled strongly of bleach, that distinctive sharp chemical odor that's impossible to mistake for anything else. In Melody's bedroom, under the sink in her private bathroom, investigators found a container. It smelled of bleach and contained a small amount of liquid that would later be tested and confirmed as bleach. It's worth noting a detail here that speaks to the state of their marriage. Roby and Melody had separate bedrooms, separate bathrooms, They were living as roommates more than spouses, maintaining separate spaces within the same home. This arrangement had perhaps made it easier for Melody to keep the bleach hidden, to carry out her alleged plan without Roby stumbling upon the evidence by accident. On July 18, 2023, Melody Filicano Johnson was arrested. She was 39 years old, a mother, a military spouse, and now she was accused of attempting to murder her husband through the slow, methodical poisoning of his morning coffee. The charges were severe: attempted first-degree murder, attempted aggravated assault, and adding poison or harmful substances to food or drink. Her bail was set at $250,000, a substantial amount that reflected the seriousness of the allegations and prosecutors' concerns that she might be a flight risk. Melody had family in the Philippines, and she had recently purchased a home there. The worry was that if released, she might flee the country rather than face trial. Unable to post bail, Melody remained in custody at the Pima County Jail, awaiting her day in court. In the aftermath of Melody's arrest, investigators and the public alike asked the same question: why? What would drive someone to poison their spouse slowly over months, adding bleach to their coffee day after day? According to Roby's statement to police, he believed Melody was trying to kill him to collect death benefits. As a member of the United States Air Force, Roby would have had life insurance policies, survivor benefits, and other financial protections in place for his family in the event of his death. If he died while they were still married, even if they were in the process of divorcing, Melody would likely have been the beneficiary of at least some of these policies. It's a motive that appears in many murder cases: financial gain through life insurance. The logic is cold and calculating: kill the spouse and collect the payout. But what made this case particularly chilling was the method. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. This was patient, deliberate, methodical. Every morning, Melody allegedly added poison to Roby's coffee. Every morning she watched him drink it, knowing what she had done. If Roby's suspicions were correct, if the poisoning had continued unchecked, what would have been the outcome? Medical experts note that chronic exposure to bleach, even in small amounts, can cause serious internal damage. Roby had experienced some symptoms. He later mentioned digestive issues, internal bleeding. Had the poisoning continued, it could have caused severe, potentially fatal damage to his internal organs, and perhaps most insidiously, his death might have been attributed to natural causes, to some illness or internal medical problem, never raising the suspicion of foul play. It's worth considering the psychological aspect as well. Melody and Roby had been together for 17 years. They had built a life together, raised a child together, navigated the challenges of military life together. At the sentencing hearing, Roby would say that throughout those 17 years, Melody had never attempted to physically harm him. He described their problems as primarily verbal and emotional, the kinds of conflicts many marriages experience, perhaps intensified by the stress of military deployments, relocations, and the other pressures that come with that lifestyle. But something had changed. Something in the breaking of their marriage had allegedly pushed Melody from verbal and emotional conflict to this, to poisoning him slowly, day by day, in the one routine he had trusted completely. After her arrest in July of 2023, Melody Johnson faced the prospect of spending decades in prison if convicted of attempted first-degree murder. The charges against her were serious, and the video evidence was compelling. At her arraignment, she entered a plea of not guilty and was assigned a public defender. But as the months passed and the case moved through the legal system, something interesting happened. Despite the severity of the crime, despite the clear video evidence of her adding bleach to her husband's coffee, there began to be discussions of a plea deal. In April of 2024, roughly 9 months after her arrest, Melody Johnson appeared in court and accepted a plea agreement. As part of the deal, the attempted murder charge was dropped. Instead, Melody pleaded guilty to 2 counts of a lesser felony, adding poison or harmful substances to food or drink. These charges specifically related to 2 incidents captured on video, July 11th and July 18th, 2023, when she had been recorded poisoning the coffee maker. The maximum sentence for each count was 2 years in prison, meaning Melody could have faced up to 4 years total. But her public defender argued for time served. Melody had been in custody since her arrest, unable to post the $250,000 bail. She had already spent nearly a year in jail awaiting trial. Her attorney pointed to this time already served, and also noted that Melody had a history of anxiety and depression. The defense painted a picture of a woman who needed mental health treatment more than additional punishment. Sentencing was scheduled for May 10th. The sentencing hearing brought an unexpected development, one that would shape the outcome of the case more than anything else. Roby Johnson, the victim, the man who had been poisoned for months, who had lived in fear while gathering evidence against his wife, addressed the court, and he asked for mercy. Through our 17-year journey together, Roby told Judge Javier Chon Lopez, she has never attempted to physically harm me until last year. Her transgressions were predominantly verbal and emotional. He acknowledged what Melody had done. He didn't minimize it or excuse it, but he also spoke to the complexity of their relationship, to the years they had spent together before this dark chapter, and then he made a request that surprised many observers of the case. While her period of incarceration may have imparted valuable lessons, Roby said, I harbor doubts that it alone will address the underlying issues. Hence, I respectfully petition that Melody be mandated to undergo mental health treatment and educational programs in concert with probation. Roby Johnson, the victim of an attempted murder, was asking the court not to send his wife to prison. He was asking for probation, for mental health treatment, for an approach that focused on addressing the psychological issues that had led to her actions, rather than simply punishing her with additional jail time. It's difficult to know exactly what motivated this request. Perhaps Roby believed that Melody truly was suffering from mental health issues that had contributed to her actions. Perhaps he was thinking of their child, who had already lost the family structure they had known, and would be further impacted by having a parent in prison. Perhaps despite everything, there remained some remnant of the bond they had formed over 17 years together. Some understanding that the woman who had poisoned him was not the complete picture of who Melody was. Melody's attorney echoed this sentiment, arguing that her client had suffered from anxiety and depression throughout the marriage. The defense described the marriage as toxic, claiming that Roby had been abusive toward Melody, and citing instances of alleged alcohol abuse. The defense painted a picture of a woman who had been pushed to a breaking point, who had acted out of desperation and mental illness rather than pure malice. Judge Javier Chon Lopez listened to all of this, to Roby's request for mercy, to the defense's arguments about mental health and abuse, to the prosecution's case about the serious nature of the crime. And on May 10, 2024, he handed down his sentence. Melody Filicano Johnson was sentenced to 3 years of probation. She would serve no additional jail time beyond the year she had already spent in custody awaiting trial. The sentence came with conditions. She was required to undergo mental health treatment and to follow any recommendations that came from her evaluation. She was also ordered not to have any contact with Roby Johnson, unless it was in a legal context, such as matters related to their ongoing divorce proceedings. The judge noted in his ruling that even the victim, Roby Johnson, had told the court he did not want Melody to end up in prison. The case of Melody Filicano Johnson and Roby Johnson raises many questions, the kind that keep people awake at night, thinking about the nature of relationships, trust, and the darkness that can exist in even the most ordinary seeming households. How does a marriage of 17 years come to this? How does the person you've built a life with, the parent of your child, the person who knows you better than almost anyone else in the world, become someone you can no longer trust, even to make your coffee? And perhaps more puzzling, how does someone who has never been physically violent before allegedly begin a months-long campaign of slow poisoning? There are no simple answers. The defense's claims of abuse and mental illness provide one possible explanation: that Melody was a victim herself, pushed to extreme actions by circumstances that the outside world didn't fully understand. The prosecution's theory about death benefits provides another: that this was a calculated attempt at murder for financial gain, dressed up as something else. The truth, as is often the case in real life, may lie somewhere in between, in the complex emotional terrain where love and hate, desperation and calculation, mental illness and deliberate action all intersect. What we know for certain is that for months Roby Johnson drank coffee that had been poisoned with bleach. We know that he suffered symptoms that he attributed to this poisoning. We know that Melody Johnson pleaded guilty to adding harmful substances to his food and drink. And we know that in the end, the victim himself asked for mercy for the person who had tried to harm him. As of May 2024, Melody began her probation sentence with mandatory mental health treatment. The divorce proceedings between Melody and Roby Johnson were still pending, the final legal dissolution of their 17-year marriage working its way through the courts. Their child would grow up knowing that their mother had tried to poison their father, a burden no child should have to carry. And so we come to the end of this story, a story about coffee that tasted wrong, about hidden cameras and bleach, about trust broken and mercy granted. It's a reminder that the darkest crimes don't always happen in shadowy alleys or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they happen in kitchens in the morning light, in the simple act of making coffee. Sometimes the most dangerous place is the one that should feel safest. I hope this story has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, not to cause nightmares, but to remind you of the complexities of human nature, of the importance of trust, and of how fragile the bonds between people can be. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far, the first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we're going to talk about a story that matters, a story about a woman named Mariah, about the choices she made to protect herself, and about a system that failed to protect her in return. This is a tale of courage and tragedy, of warning signs ignored and of a life cut far too short. Take a deep breath, let the tension leave your shoulders. In the late summer of 2025, in the Willard Hay neighborhood of North Minneapolis, there lived a woman named Mariah Rosanna Samuels. She was 34 years old, and if you asked anyone who knew her, they would tell you the same thing: there was nobody else like her in this whole world. Mariah worked as a dog groomer. She had gentle hands and a patient spirit, the kind of person animals trusted instinctively. Her clients loved her, not just because she was skilled at her craft, but because she treated every pet as if it were her own. She had that gift, the ability to make others feel seen, feel cared for. She was a mother to 2 sons. Her eldest was 11 years old, a boy she loved fiercely. She had dreams for him, hopes that he would grow up safe and strong. Her younger son looked up to her too, watching her navigate the world with that free spirit everyone talked about. Mariah's family was close-knit. Her sisters Simone Hunter and Selena Owens were her confidants, her protectors when she needed them. Her aunt, Yvonne Winston, would later say that Mariah was living her dream life. She loved butterflies. At memorials held in her honor, mourners would wear buttons adorned with butterflies, symbols of transformation, of beauty, of a life that should have been allowed to flourish. She was outgoing, sweet, free-spirited. Those are the words her sister Selena used to describe her. Mariah traveled when she could, explored the world, loved people deeply. She had a best friend named Connie Willis, who would later stand at rallies, tears streaming down her face, saying simply, Mariah's life mattered. But in the summer of 2025, Mariah's life became entangled with danger. Sometimes, you meet someone, and you think you know them. You think you see who they really are. But people can hide darkness behind charming smiles. They can conceal violence beneath soft words. David Eugene Wright was 51 years old when Mariah met him. He had spent 15 years in federal prison for firearms offenses. Before that, back in 2003, he had been convicted of domestic assault. The details of that earlier case were chilling. Wright had pointed a stolen handgun at his then-girlfriend and her 15-year-old child after the woman ended their relationship. When the teenager tried to call 911, Wright ripped the phone from the wall, smashed it on the ground, and threatened to shoot them both. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for that crime. Wright met Mariah less than a year after his release from federal prison. At the time, he was on supervised release, supposed to be monitored, supposed to be held accountable. He was legally prohibited from possessing firearms. For 7 months, Mariah was in a relationship with David Wright. 7 months that would change everything. We don't know what those early days looked like. Perhaps he was charming at first. Perhaps he said the right things, made the right promises. But by August of 2025, Mariah knew she needed to get out. On August 21st, she called him. Over the phone, she ended the relationship. Hours later, Wright tracked her down. It was evening on August 21st when Mariah went to drop off her 11-year-old son at his father's home in North Minneapolis, just a couple of blocks from where she lived with her own father. She thought she was safe. She thought that ending things over the phone would give her distance, would give her space. But Wright had been watching. He knew where she was. When Mariah stepped outside, Wright was waiting. What happened next was captured on a surveillance camera. Footage that Mariah would later post to Facebook in a desperate attempt to be heard, to be believed. Wright pistol whipped her. He struck her repeatedly in the face and upper body with a gun. He threw her against a fence. He grabbed her throat. While still armed, he threatened to kill her. He threatened to kill anyone left in the home. A friend witnessed the attack over FaceTime, hearing Mariah's screams, helpless to intervene. Mariah called the police. But by the time they arrived, Wright had fled. The responding Minneapolis police officer conducted a risk assessment. The results were clear. David Wright posed a serious threat to Mariah's safety. Mariah cooperated with the officer. She told him everything. She gave her statement. She did exactly what domestic violence victims are told to do. But no investigator was ever assigned to her case. 5 days later, on August 26th, a domestic violence advocate from Hennepin County visited Mariah at her home. Together they filled out a petition for an order for protection, a restraining order. In that petition, Mariah detailed everything. She wrote about how Wright had threatened to blow up the house where she lived with her father and youngest son. She described the pistol whipping, the choking, the threats. She requested protection for herself and her 11-year-old. The next day, August 27th, a judge signed the order for protection. It was formally filed in court. On August 29th, David Wright was served with the order. Legally, he was now barred from any contact with Mariah. If he violated that order, he could be arrested. For 2 weeks, there was an uneasy quiet. But David Wright was not the kind of man to respect boundaries. His text messages to Mariah became increasingly threatening. Cell phone records would later reveal escalating behavior, controlling messages, jealous accusations, threats of violence. In one text he wrote, "Man, someone going to die tonight." Mariah was afraid, but she was also determined to protect herself, to protect her children. She stayed at her ex-partner's house, trying to keep her location hidden from Wright. She believed the system would protect her. She had done everything right. September 14, 2025, began in darkness. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, David Wright sent Mariah a flurry of text messages. He was jealous, convinced she was seeing another man. The messages were angry, accusatory, harassing. Mariah woke to those messages on her phone, her heart sinking. She was staying at her ex-partner's home in North Minneapolis, a place she had hoped Wright wouldn't know about. But something felt wrong. She was convinced that Wright had been to the property. She thought he had tampered with her vehicle. At 5:14 in the morning, Mariah called 911. She told the dispatcher that Wright was violating the restraining order, that he was sending her threatening messages. 2 Minneapolis police officers arrived at the home shortly after. One of them was Officer Ryan Weber. Mariah showed Officer Weber the text messages. She asked him to examine her vehicle, to check if Wright had damaged it. She was certain Wright had come to the property. She was certain he was stalking her. Officer Weber wrote in his official report that Mariah told him she felt safe and that Wright would not have knowledge of the address, but that wasn't true. Later, when investigators reviewed body camera footage from that morning, they found something disturbing. Mariah never said she felt safe. The words Officer Weber attributed to her, words that might have changed everything, were never spoken. The footage shows a brief interaction. Mariah shares the harassing text messages. She emphasizes that Wright should have no reason to contact her, no reason to come to the house, but she never says she feels safe. Officer Weber observed in his report that Mariah did not appear scared or frightened of Wright. He noted that he could find no evidence of damage to her vehicle. He did not offer her domestic violence resources. He left. It was not yet 6 in the morning. At 7:37 in the morning, Mariah posted something to Facebook. She uploaded surveillance video of the August 21st assault, the video showing Wright attacking her, pistol whipping her, throwing her against a fence. She included screenshots of recent text messages from Wright. 8 minutes later, at 7:45, Mariah posted again. This time, her words were filled with frustration and fear. She accused Minneapolis police of not doing enough to protect her. She wrote that her ex-boyfriend had threatened her family, that he had damaged her car, that she was being stalked that morning, and law enforcement wasn't providing adequate protection. Her cries were public now, visible to anyone who followed her on social media. She was asking for help in the only way she knew how. 5 minutes after that post, at 7:50 in the morning, Mariah left the house. She got into her SUV. Perhaps she was going home. Perhaps she was running an errand. Perhaps she just needed to breathe, to move, to do something normal in a world that no longer felt safe. David Wright was waiting. Multiple witnesses saw what happened next. Wright approached the SUV. He opened fire. 15 discharged cartridge casings would later be found at the scene. Mariah was shot multiple times in the chest and torso. The medical examiner would later count 10 gunshot wounds. A witness in an upstairs bedroom of a nearby home heard 5 gunshots, then screaming, then more gunfire. He looked out his window and saw Mariah on the street, one leg still partly inside her SUV, her body slumped. Another witness saw Wright trying to pull Mariah from the vehicle. When he realized he couldn't drive away, He grabbed a bicycle from the SUV and fled the scene. By 7:50 that morning, just minutes after posting her desperate plea on Facebook, Mariah Rosanna Samuels was dead. She died on the street, just feet from her front door, in the 1400 block of Russell Avenue North. Emergency medical responders arrived and declared her dead at the scene. David Wright was arrested the next day in Anoka, a city just north of Minneapolis. During his interview at the Hennepin County Jail, he did not deny what he had done. He told officers, "I'm not going to fight this situation. This is not going to be a hard-fought case." He encouraged police to read the text messages between him and Mariah, as if those messages would somehow justify murder, as if jealousy and control were reasonable explanations for taking a life. Wright was initially charged with second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. Bail was set at $1 million, but Mariah's family knew that second-degree murder wasn't enough. They knew that Wright had a documented history of violence against women and minors. They knew he had been on federal supervised release and should never have been free to harm anyone. In late November, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office upgraded the charges. A grand jury indicted David Wright on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for premeditated murder, and 1 for murder with a past pattern of domestic abuse. If convicted on either count, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty said in a statement, "The system we entrust to keep us safe failed to protect Mariah. Despite her doing everything we ask of victims of domestic violence, Mariah's family organized rallies. Nearly 200 people marched from the site of her death to the 4th Police Precinct, chanting her name, demanding accountability. They wore purple, the color associated with domestic violence awareness. They carried banners with Mariah's photo, her smile bright in the pictures, full of life. Her sister Simone Hunter stood before crowds and said, 'My sister did not deserve to die, not to be murdered like that, so brutally. She did not deserve that.' Her aunt Yvonne Winston said, 'We've had 2 battles to fight. We had to fight against domestic violence and then against our own justice system to get them to react and act in the way that Black and Native American women deserve.'" The Minneapolis Police Department's handling of Mariah's case revealed systemic failures that had been building for years. When Wright attacked Mariah on August 21st, police responded, but because Wright had fled before they arrived, the case was labeled "gone on arrival." Such cases were supposed to be investigated, but due to severe understaffing, Mariah's case sat in a growing backlog. No investigator was ever assigned. No one went looking for Wright, even though he was on federal supervised release and legally prohibited from possessing firearms. The department's domestic assault unit had only 5 investigators, down from a dozen in 2019. Domestic violence incidents were the 5th most common emergency call in Minneapolis, comprising roughly 1/3 of all aggravated assaults in the city since 2019. Yet the resources dedicated to these cases had been cut in half. When Mariah called 911 on the morning of September 14th, Officer Weber's response was inadequate. He misrepresented what Mariah said in his official report, claiming she felt safe when she never said those words. He did not offer her domestic violence resources. He did not recognize the urgency of her situation. Hours later, Mariah was dead. It's unclear why Wright's federal probation officer was never notified that Wright had been named as a suspect in the armed assault against Mariah. It's unclear why he wasn't immediately sent back to jail. He had violated the conditions of his release. He was a danger to the community, but the system failed to act. In the aftermath of a Minnesota Star Tribune investigation, Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara ordered a thorough review of the department's handling of Mariah's case. He directed every officer in the police force to be retrained on domestic assault protocols by the end of 2025. He acknowledged that Mariah's murder had shined a harsh light on an ugly truth about staffing shortages and resource allocation. But for Mariah's family, these reforms came too late. They demanded a formal apology from the Minneapolis Police Department. They called for full transparency. They wanted to know why their sister, their daughter, their friend had been left unprotected despite doing everything she was supposed to do. When Wright was scheduled to make his first court appearance after the upgraded charges, he refused to appear. Mariah's family sat in the courtroom, waiting to see the man who had stolen their loved one, and he wouldn't even show his face. Simone Hunter said, "It's just a slap in the face. Just stand up for what you did. You committed a heinous act. You should be held accountable. You know what you did was wrong." Mariah's story is not unique, and that is perhaps the most devastating truth of all. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death for women in the United States. Too often, victims do everything they're told to do. They call the police. They file restraining orders. They cooperate with investigations, and they are still killed by their abusers. The gaps in the system are well documented. Understaffed police departments struggle to prioritize domestic violence cases. Restraining orders, while important, are pieces of paper that cannot physically protect someone from a determined abuser. Federal and state agencies often fail to communicate effectively, allowing dangerous individuals to slip through the cracks. Mariah's aunt pointed out that the family had to fight two battles, one against domestic violence itself and another against their own justice system to get it to respond appropriately. Black and Native American women, she said, deserve the same urgency and protection as anyone else. After Mariah's death, Minneapolis officials acknowledged that the city was working on developing a permanent, multidisciplinary domestic violence response team. The goal was to identify high-risk patterns and intervene before situations escalated to homicide. But Mariah's case had already been flagged as high risk. A domestic violence navigator had reached out to her. An order for protection had been filed. The risk assessment conducted by police had clearly indicated that Wright was a serious threat. Despite all of this, Mariah was killed. Organizations that support domestic violence victims are chronically underfunded. Shelters operate at capacity. Advocates are stretched thin. State and federal budget cuts make it harder to provide the comprehensive services that could save lives. Experts emphasize that there is no single solution. Domestic violence is complex, and victims respond to abuse in different ways. Some leave immediately, some return to their abusers multiple times before finally escaping. Some, like Mariah, do everything right and still lose their lives. On September 20th, 6 days after Mariah's death, her family held a walk in her memory. They started at 1409 Russell Avenue North, the place where she died, and walked to the 4th Police Precinct. People gathered to remember the woman Mariah had been. They spoke of her love for animals, her skill as a groomer, the way she made people feel seen. They talked about her 2 sons, now left without a mother. They remembered her free spirit, her outgoing nature, her sweetness. Connie Willis, Mariah's best friend, said she traveled the world, she groomed dogs, she loved people, and was full of life. Her sister Selena said, "I question God on this one. I know we're not supposed to, but it's like she was the sacrifice. It was already written. I love her. I'm going to miss her. But what makes me at peace is just knowing she's about to change the world." And perhaps that is the hope that remains, that Mariah's death will not be in vain, that her story will force systemic change, that other women in similar situations will be protected in ways Mariah was not. The Minneapolis City Council passed a resolution demanding answers from police about how Mariah's case was handled. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights, which had already found that the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department engaged in a pattern or practice of race discrimination, continued its investigations. Community activists and domestic violence advocates used Mariah's case as a rallying cry for better protections, better funding, better training. At the end of 2025, David Wright remained in the Hennepin County Jail, awaiting trial. The charges against him, first-degree premeditated murder and first-degree murder with a past pattern of domestic abuse, carried the possibility of life in prison without parole. No trial date has been set. The legal process moves slowly, but Mariah's family has vowed to be present for every hearing, every proceeding. They will not let her be forgotten. They will not let the system forget its failures. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think of Mariah. Think of a woman who loved butterflies, who groomed dogs with gentle hands, who had 2 sons she adored. Think of a woman who did everything she was supposed to do to protect herself. And think about what her story asks of all of us. It asks us to listen when someone says they're afraid. It asks us to believe survivors. It asks us to demand better from the institutions that are supposed to keep us safe. It asks us to recognize that a piece of paper, in order for protection, cannot stop a bullet. Domestic violence is not a private matter. It is a public health crisis. It is a failure of our communities, our legal systems, our collective willingness to act. If you know someone who is afraid, reach out. If you are afraid yourself, know that there are people who want to help, even when the system fails. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788. Maria's story ends in tragedy, but it does not have to be the end of the conversation. Let her life and her death mean something. Let it change the world, just as her sister believed it would. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey to the heart of Central California, to a small city where families gather, where neighborhoods know one another, and where on one September evening, a life filled with light came to a devastating end. This is a story about love that began in innocence, about promises made too young, and about the moment when letting go became impossible for one person to accept. So, let me tell you about Yesenia Roca. In the autumn of 2025, in the quiet town of Reedley, California, there lived a woman who friends and family described as radiant. Yesenia Roca, known to those closest to her as Jessie, was 43 years old that September. She was a mother, a friend, a daughter, and to those who knew her best, she was quite simply light itself. Martha Amescua, one of Yesenia's closest friends, would later say that she and Jessie texted every single day. They had a group chat, a small circle of women who shared their lives, their laughter, their struggles. In that digital space, Yesenia was the one who lifted others up, who brought energy and joy into every conversation. Another friend, Darlene Tews, remembered Yesenia's smile. Radiant, she called it. The kind of smile that could light up a room the moment she walked in. Beautiful inside and out, Darlene said, and she meant every word. Yesenia had 2 children, a daughter named Kayla, 23 years old, and a son named Jacob, 20 years old. To them she was everything, the center of their universe, the person who was always there, who always understood, who shined so very bright in their lives. But there is something you should know about Yesenia's story. Something that reaches back decades, to a time when she was just a girl sitting in a middle school classroom. Picture, if you will, two young teenagers in a California middle school. The hallways filled with the sound of locker doors slamming, the chatter of adolescent voices, the nervous energy of first crushes and fragile friendships. This is where Michael Rocha met Yesenia. This is where their story began. They were middle schoolers when they started dating. Just kids, really, with their whole lives stretching out before them like an unmarked road. They fell in love the way young people do, with intensity and certainty, with the belief that what they felt would last forever. And in a way it did. They dated through their teenage years, through high school, through the milestones of growing up. Eventually they married. The years passed, one after another, building a life together. 25 years of marriage, a quarter of a century, 2 children born, a family created. From the outside it might have looked like a love story for the ages. Childhood sweethearts who made it work, who beat the odds, who turned young love into lasting commitment. But beneath the surface, something was fracturing. In August of 2025, after 25 years of marriage, Yesenia made a decision. She filed for divorce. The couple had been separated for 2 months by early September. 2 months of living apart, of renegotiating what their lives would look like without each other. For Yesenia, friends would later say, this was an act of courage. She was choosing freedom. She was choosing herself. Martha Imescua remembered thinking how brave Yesenia was for leaving, for wanting that freedom, even if it was just for a little while. In Martha's eyes, the fact that Yesenia got to feel that freedom, even briefly, was a victory. But for Michael Rocha, the separation was something else entirely. According to his own mother, Rita Rocha, Michael simply could not cope. He couldn't accept that the woman he'd loved since middle school, the woman he called his sweetheart, his soulmate, the love of his life, was choosing to leave him. Rita would later tell reporters, through tears, that both families were now destroyed. Her son had been the world to her. Yesenia had been the world to her children. And now, because Michael couldn't let go, everyone had lost everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that September day, to the moments before everything shattered. September 6th, 2025. A Saturday afternoon in Reedley, the day began like any other. Yesenia texted Martha that morning around 6:40. Just a normal conversation between friends who talked every day. There was nothing in those messages to suggest what was coming. No warning, no goodbye. That afternoon, there was a family gathering. The location was near the corner of Parley and Frankwood Avenues, a neighborhood intersection that would soon become a memorial site, covered in flowers and candles and tears. Family members were there. Yesenia's children were there. Kayla and Jacob, young adults now, spending time with their mother and other relatives. It was meant to be an ordinary gathering, the kind of weekend afternoon that families share without thinking twice about it. But Michael Rocha showed up, the man who had known Yesenia since they were children, the man who had been married to her for 25 years, the man who, according to his mother, didn't want to live without her, and didn't want her to live without him either. Reedley Police Chief Mark Ettinger would later explain what happened next. Michael approached a car where Yesenia was sitting. He walked up to the vehicle, calm and deliberate in his movements, and then he opened fire. Witnesses said there were 15 gunshots, 15 distinct cracks that shattered the afternoon quiet. Some accounts said 10 bullets struck Yesenia. Others said it was more. The exact number doesn't matter really. What matters is that Michael Rocha fired again and again and again, in front of his own children, in front of family members, destroying the woman he claimed to love more than life itself. The call came into Reedley Police just before 5:30 that evening, though some reports said it was closer to 8. A shooting. Multiple gunshots fired. A woman down. When officers arrived at Parley and Frankwood Avenues, They found Yesenia Roca deceased in a vehicle. She had sustained multiple fatal gunshot wounds. There was nothing anyone could do. She was 43 years old, and Michael Rocha was gone. He had fled the scene in his white Chevrolet pickup truck, disappearing into the California landscape while his family stood frozen in the aftermath of what he'd done. Some relatives tried to follow him. They drove after him, desperate to stop him, to catch him, to do something. But he was too fast, and the police, for those first crucial hours, had no idea where he'd gone. The community was frightened. A murderer was on the loose, driving somewhere through Fresno County armed and dangerous. Michael's own sister, Gina Roca, provided photos of her brother and his truck to the Reedley Police Department. She demanded justice for her beautiful sister-in-law, justice that she said would not wait, would not rest, until Michael was found. Dead or alive, the night passed. Michael Roca remained free. Sunday, September the 7th, the day after Yesenia's murder, somewhere between 10 and 11 that morning, a white Chevy pickup truck was spotted in Woodlake, a small community about 30 miles southeast of Reedley in neighboring Tulare County. Deputies from the Tulare County Sheriff's Office received the report. They moved in to investigate. When they located Michael Roca's truck around 1 in the afternoon, they attempted to conduct a traffic stop. Michael didn't stop. Instead, a pursuit began. Michael drove, and deputies followed, their vehicles racing down rural roads. And then, from inside his truck, Michael did something that sealed his fate. He fired a rifle at the pursuing deputies. The sound of gunfire erupted again, this time aimed at law enforcement officers who were simply trying to bring him in. Deputies had no choice but to return fire. The pursuit continued, bullets flying, until the chase ended near Road 222 and Avenue 340, just outside Woodlake. Michael Roca stopped his truck. He got out of the vehicle, rifle in hand, and he opened fire on the deputies once more. Multiple rounds, witnesses said. He was trying to kill them, just as he had killed his wife. The deputies fired back. Sheriff Mike Boudreau would later tell reporters that Michael got what he deserved. The deputies struck their target. Michael Roca fell. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was nothing to be done. He was pronounced dead where he lay, less than 24 hours after he had murdered the woman he claimed was his soulmate. In the span of one weekend, one violent weekend, Kayla and Jacob Rocha lost both of their parents. Their mother, the light of their world, was shot down in front of them. Their father, the man who should have protected them, protected her, became the person who took everything away. Jacob would later tell reporters that he wished he could see his mother one more time, hold her one more time, tell her he loved her, give her one last hug. But that man, he said, took everything away from them. That man, not even calling him father anymore. Kayla spoke of her mother's brightness, her constant presence, the way she was always there for her children. Everything to us, she said. Everything. And now, nothing. Rita Rocha, Michael's mother, faced her own unbearable grief. She had lost her son, but unlike her grandchildren, she understood exactly who was responsible. She didn't make excuses. She called her son's actions cowardly. She said he chose the cowardly way out because he couldn't cope with divorce, couldn't accept that his sweetheart no longer wanted to be his. Jacob spoke of a future that would never come. His mother would never be a grandmother to his children. His sister's children would never know their grandmother's radiant smile. All of those moments, all of those possibilities, erased in 15 gunshots on a September afternoon. In the days that followed, a memorial grew at the corner of Parlier and Frankwood Avenues. Flowers piled up, candles flickered in the evening light, notes were left, words of love and loss scrawled on paper and cardboard, messages for a woman who would never read them. On Sunday, September 14th, 1 week after Michael's death, The community of Reedley gathered for a candlelight vigil. Friends and family came together, not just to mourn Yesenia, but to remind themselves to be grateful for their own lives. Because we are not promised tomorrow, they said. Because what happened to Yesenia could happen to anyone. Martha Amescua and Darlene Toes were there, along with countless others who had known Yesenia. They shared stories, they cried, they wondered, as survivors always do, if there was something more they could have done. Martha said they thought they had a good support system in place for Yesenia. They thought they were helping her through the separation, through the divorce, through this new chapter of her life. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Because they weren't protecting her from a stranger, they were trying to protect her from a man who had known her since they were 12 years old. A GoFundMe was established to help with funeral costs. The description read, Yesenia was deeply loved by family, friends, and everyone who had the blessing of knowing her. Her absence leaves a hole that can never truly be filled. What drives a person to such violence? What makes someone believe that if they cannot have the person they love, then no one should? These are questions that plague domestic violence cases. Questions that echo through courtrooms and counseling sessions and support groups across the world. The answers are complex, tangled in psychology and culture and individual circumstance. But perhaps the better question is this: how do we stop it? Yesenia showed courage when she filed for divorce. She took the step that so many people in dangerous relationships struggle to take. She left. She chose freedom, and still it wasn't enough to save her. According to research and statistics from domestic violence organizations, the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is often when they try to leave. The act of leaving threatens the abuser's control, their sense of ownership over another human being, and some abusers, like Michael Roca, would rather destroy what they cannot control than let it go. Michael and Yesenia's story began in innocence, in middle school hallways and teenage dreams. But somewhere along the way, love became possession, commitment became control, and when Yesenia tried to reclaim her autonomy, Michael made sure she would never have the chance. Let's not remember Yesenia Roca for how she died. Let's remember her for how she lived. She was a mother who was everything to her children, a friend who texted every day, who lifted others up, who brought energy and light wherever she went, a woman with a radiant smile that could fill a room, a person who, in her final months, found the courage to choose herself, to want freedom, to believe she deserved better. Her friend Martha said that even though Yesenia's freedom was brief, it was still a victory that she got to feel it at all, that she got to experience, even for a little while, what it felt like to make her own choices, to live on her own terms. Kayla and Jacob carry their mother's memory now. They lean on family and faith, trying to navigate a world that no longer includes the woman who is their light. They will never stop missing her. They will never stop wishing things had been different. And we, listening to their story, can honor Yesenia by remembering that domestic violence is not always loud and obvious. Sometimes it wears the face of a childhood sweetheart. Sometimes it hides behind 25 years of marriage and middle school memories. The warning signs were there, perhaps. The inability to cope with separation, the desperation, the sense that Yesenia belonged to Michael rather than to herself. But hindsight is always clearer than the moment we're living in. And so we come to the end of Yesenia's story, a story that began in hope and ended in tragedy. A story that reminds us how fragile life can be, how quickly light can be extinguished. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. In Fresno County, the Marjorie Mason Center is available at 559-2334. 357. You are not alone. You do not have to stay. There are people who will help you find safety. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm, late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.